Hello and welcome to Story Untold. I'm Martin Bauman and I'm really excited about this week's guest. He's a guy I've known for a few years now. I got to know him as I was just getting started in the broadcasting industry, and he was the guy that you looked at, Exhibit A, of what it meant to be involved in local radio and be there in the community. He still is. Mike Farwell is his name. He's the voice thousands of people in Waterloo Region wake up to every morning, and he's become almost synonymous with the community, whether it's being the voice of the Kitchener Rangers or a big supporter of the library or an MC for just about every event you can think of. He does a lot, but it makes sense when you learn he's living life for two other people who never got to finish theirs. Mike lost two sisters to cystic fibrosis when he was in his early 20s, and now, each May, he's made it his mission to do as much as he can to support others in finding a cure. He's the man behind Farwell for Hire, and he's someone I'm proud to call a friend. Here's his story. So today we're in Block 3 Brewery in St. Jacobs, Ontario, in a place where in a few days, and by the time this is out, it'll be out already, but there will be a beer with your face on it, and the funds go towards Cystic Fibrosis Canada. Do you ever look at your life and just think, how did I end up here?
Oh man, you're starting with the big ones, eh? As a matter of fact, I do from time to time, and we have to be fair about this. When you say my face, it's a caricature. I would be very careful about the actual face being on the bottle. But yeah, you know what? I do think about that a lot, Martin, because I'm a long-time radio nerd, and I grew up in this community listening to what was then 570 Chime on the AM dial. It was the station that everybody listened to, and I think today most people do. Chime is the heritage radio station in town, and I loved it. I can still tell you, well, it was George Michaels in the morning, followed by Vern Rombo over the midday. Then there was Dave Schneider, an afternoon drive. There was Brother Neil Beaumont going through the evenings, and this guy named Glenn Pelche did overnights. I mean, it was just fascinating to me. I used to win contests on 570 Chime when I was a kid listening to the radio. And so, yeah, sometimes I do. When I walked through the same halls as these guys as a colleague, it really struck me. And if I take a moment to breathe and look at things, I do wonder how it all came to be, because I got into radio for one reason and one reason only, and that's because I loved the medium. I was fascinated by it. I never had any illusions about anybody knowing my name. I never had any illusions about people even listening to what I do. I just wanted to get a job at a radio station and work at it. And here we are where, yeah, you kind of, can you call it full circle? I'd hate to think this is the end. I hope I have a few more years yet, but for somebody to say, let's make a beer and put your likeness on it, it's pretty cool.
It does sound like full circle to me. And now I don't want to get things going with a bald joke, but you're a man that wears many hats. You're a Kitchener Rangers broadcaster, voice of the Rangers, a morning show host, a fundraiser for Cystic Fibrosis Canada, and overall just a guy who gives a damn. Where did that come from, that influence on you in being somebody who cares?
It came first and foremost from my parents. They cared deeply and were heavily involved in a variety of things as I was growing up. We were closely connected to Cystic Fibrosis Canada, obviously because I had two sisters with the illness. But my mom would go door to door on behalf of the Canadian Cancer Society and a variety of charities, back when door to door was a way to collect money for charity. So that's where it all began. But two things stand out to me, and because I've been asked this before, I have them at the ready. But this is truly, it was one of those things. I was at an event. I had just begun doing a little bit more volunteering in the community. And we were at a dinner, and the MC, who happened to be Neil Aitchison, who's extraordinarily well known in these here parts, he brought out a quote, and I don't know if it's Neil's or somebody else's, but he said, "Community service is the rent we pay for the space we occupy." And I've never forgotten that. And then, wouldn't you know, a few years after that, I'm reading a biography on Roberto Clemente. The only reason I wanted to read the biography on Roberto Clemente is because I'm a huge baseball fan. Now, you already mentioned the Kitchener Rangers thing, so I acknowledge that it's a little bit of a paradox to say, but if you ask me on a summer's day when I'm sitting there with a beer watching a game what my favorite sport is, I might tell you it's baseball. I love the game so much. So I'd heard a lot about this Latin American player and the impact that he had and the kind of player that he was. I thought, I have to read up on this. Well, wouldn't you know, in reading the biography, I found out about Roberto Clemente, the humanitarian. I had no idea that side of him. And there was a quote from Clemente in the biography that said, "A person who has the ability to help others and fails to do so has wasted his life." And again, one of those things that I just never forgot. And I honestly started thinking, well, what can I do? Like, I'm a radio broadcaster. What can I possibly do to help other people? And I started sort of offering myself out as an MC, because some people aren't comfortable in front of crowds, or they can have their event move more smoothly, whatever it may be. And one thing just led to another. But I believe in that. I believe that this community, the community that I was raised in, helped me earn a living. I got my education here, all kinds of different things I can point to. And it just seemed to be the right thing to do.
You just mentioned it, the community that you were raised in, growing up here in the area, in Waterloo region. What was that like? What was your childhood like? What's a young Mike Farwell like?
Same as this Mike Farwell, except with a little bit more hair. I wasn't much taller. I've always been short. But I've often said that I had the most middle-class, vanilla existence you'll ever want. My dad was a lifelong teacher and educator. He finished up as a principal. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. And that was it. Like, I mean, I had everything you could want. And I mean that, like, it was middle class all the way. It wasn't luxury by any stretch of the imagination. But when I was a kid, I would come home from school for lunch. That's what we got to do, right? So it was just, I had 4 siblings, 1 older brother, 1 older sister, and 2 younger sisters. And as the 5 of us, I mean, we were our own entertainment quite often, out in the backyard, out around the community. My mother, I'll never forget, like, she would walk us, all 5 children, everywhere. I spent my life downtown at Bud's department store and Gowdy's when it was still there. Those kinds of things. So the shopping experiences for whatever, household items and clothing with my mom. My dad would come home with his briefcase after work, and we'd sit down to a family dinner. There was a rule in our household that you couldn't call on friends before noon on a Sunday because, I was raised very Catholic. We went to church every week. It was very important. Confession, bless me, Father, for I have sinned, once a month. That was part of our upbringing as well. Cottages on both sides with my grandparents. Each had a cottage, one in Hanover, one in Port Elgin, so we'd spend time there in the summers. We took family vacations in this big old 1976 Ford LTD station wagon. I mean, that was life, and there was a lot of outdoor play. I rode a bicycle like you wouldn't believe. You'd never know it now because I hardly exercise at all, but all the time with a bicycle, road hockey, baseball, anything we could do to be outdoors. But that was it. It was a beautiful middle class existence.
Where did the love of radio begin?
I think the first time I turned it on. I couldn't tell you for sure, but I can promise you that it's the only thing I ever wanted to do with my life. I actually started out to become a teacher, just like my dad, because being on the radio wasn't a real job, right? I'd met some announcers because I was collecting prizes from their station, and I listened, but it just didn't seem like a real thing. But I do, as I mentioned earlier, remember listening to 570 AM, 570 Chime when it was the station around here. And man, oh man, Martin, 680 CFTR, before it was 680 News, right? That was top 40 radio. Tom Rivers. I got to work with Tom Rivers early in my career. I'll tell you a quick Mike Cooper story, who was on 680 CFTR too. And this was top 40 radio for a kid that was coming into his teens, and that's what I wanted to listen to.
Right.
So fast forward to just a few years ago. I'm working at the Fan in Toronto. I think I've really accomplished something now. I'm in the biggest media market in the country, working for the biggest sports radio station in Canada. I'm a bit of a sports nut. This is great. So in the same building was CHFI, and doing mornings on CHFI was Mike Cooper with Aaron Davis. I passed Mike Cooper in the halls every single day. Every day. I'm doing mornings on the Fan. He's doing mornings on CHFI. And it took me about 6 months until I finally said, to heck with it, I'm doing this. And I stopped him in the hall and I said, Mike, I hate to do this, but I have to. I listened to you growing up, and I just want to say it's an honor to meet you. And he laughed, and he was so good about it, right? But I had to do it. And I mean, I can still hear splitters in my head, the little things they play between songs on the radio, and commercial-free Sundays on CFTR. I would go to sleep on Sunday nights listening to the Chum Countdown, Top 30. It's always been a part of my life.
What was your first gig in the business?
My very first gig in the business was overnights in Brantford at CKPC, Light Hits, 92.1 FM. Brant Ford, the owner, that was a private owner back then, Dick Buchanan, made us say Brant Ford. That was a part-time gig that I started in June of 1995, and 14 months later, I got hired full-time out in British Columbia, a little town called Salmon Arm. I got on a plane and I flew 4 provinces to a place I had never been before, and I'd only looked at on a map, and geography was never really my strong suit. And a quick aside, so I got out there, and my very first day in Salmon Arm, I was wandering around trying to get a feel for the place. I mean, it's a tiny town, but about 15,000 people. But I remember going to a Dairy Queen on the side of the Trans-Canada Highway to make a collect call back home to tell mom and dad that, hey, I'm here, everything's fine, I'm just kind of figuring things out. And I also remember that day, it was like 36 or 37 degrees Celsius. We were the hottest spot in all of Canada that day. And as a lover of summer and somebody that doesn't like winter much, again, paradox with the hockey thing, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I'm working full-time in radio, and I'm in the hottest community in Canada right now on my first day out there.
Are you calling hockey at that time already, or when does that come into the picture?
Oh, man. You want me to tell you the story? I BS'd my way into calling hockey. So the short answer is no, I was not calling hockey yet. When I got into radio, I had, my goal was I'm either going to be the very next John Derringer, Q107, legendary morning man, so I'm going to be an FM jock doing morning radio, or I'm going to be the next Bob Cole. I'm going to call hockey games on Hockey Night in Canada. So that job out in British Columbia was swing shift announcer. So I was the DJ, and I worked weekday evenings and weekend mornings, and we were playing light rock. Celine Dion, Elton John, Bryan Adams, you name it, right? And I started getting a little bit more involved in our newsroom, because in a small town you can do pretty much anything, and I wasn't sure, certainly, that evenings is where I wanted to stay and this and that. So the news director said to me, well, if you want to get into sports, news is the way to go. So he started teaching me a little bit more. So there's a little hockey league out there called the KIJHL, the Kootenay International Junior Hockey League. And the Sicamous Eagles were a team, and the, who else did we have out there? I can't remember, but the Sicamous Eagles was the team I covered. Anyway, and by covered, I mean, as a reporter, I went out to just file reports on playoff games, and so the newsroom would have them. There was very little sports involved other than the story was the game. And so I kind of got my feet wet there. And my next job took me up to Thunder Bay, where I was full-time in news, and then I made my way back to Southern Ontario. And I read this ad in the newspaper. It wasn't even a trade magazine. And it said, Rogers TV is starting a new daytime talk show, and we need hosts, or a host. It's the show that's still on today with Susan Cook-Shear, who is wonderful and deserved that chair way over me, but 20 years ago almost, I applied for that job. So I'm in line at Stone Road Mall in Guelph. And it's the silliest thing. And they're doing open auditions. So you wait in line, you hand in your resume at the end of the line, they put you in front of a camera, you do a screen test right there in the mall. How classy is that, right? I get to the front of the line, I hand my resume to the young lady. Her name is Lisa Leachman, still a great friend. I hand my resume to her, and she looks at it, and I had written some highlights at the top of it, including sports experience with the KIJHL. She looks at this resume and says, you've done sports before? Oh, yeah, of course I have, right? And I'm like, gonna exaggerate a little bit. And she's like, we need a sports guy. So here's our sports producer's name and phone number. If he doesn't call you tomorrow, you call him. I never went the rest of the way through that line to do a screen test at all. The next day, the sports producer actually called me, and if it wasn't that very weekend, it was the next. I was on the sidelines at Seagram Stadium in Waterloo doing OUA, it wasn't even the CIS yet, OUA football for Rogers TV. I got a great relationship with this producer. One thing leads to another. I expressed my interest in hockey. 2 years later, I'm doing OHL games in Guelph. The rest is history.
Take me back to Thunder Bay, first of all. What that time period is like, what the station was like there, and your time in the city.
It was a challenging time for me. I learned so much, and through the benefit of my years now and hindsight, I can look back to how good the experience was. But I think I mentioned earlier that geography was never my strong suit. So when I was in British Columbia, the biggest goal I had after a little while was getting back to Ontario. I had no idea that Thunder Bay, Ontario was so far removed from the Ontario that I know.
Long way,
It's
yeah.
a long way. It was a 22-hour Greyhound bus ride. I didn't have a car at the time. So that's how far from home I was. It was tough. And Thunder Bay was cold and remote. I mean, I always call it, I still call it the big city in the middle of nowhere. Because you've got it, and then you've got like Rainy River over here and Wawa over there, and Keноra's even hours away. So there's not much going on outside the city. So I struggled a little bit. But I will say this. Vic Krasowski was the name of the news director. He's still working up there at now the Giant in Thunder Bay. And he taught me so much about news. I worked for, it was funny, when I was out in Salmon Arm, it was 580 CKXR. I go up to Thunder Bay, it's 580 CKPR. And then I come back to Kitchener, it's 570 CKG. I mean, I just couldn't get away from the 570, 580 on the AM dial. So 580 CKPR was our AM station up there. And we were doing a lot of news back then, a whole lot of news. And he taught me so gosh darn much. It was a great city to do news in because there was a pretty high crime rate. There was a pretty strong native population nearby, which also led to a variety of story angles and ideas and things like that. So it was great, but it was just unfortunate that the time wasn't great for me because I was young and it felt so remote. And again, I look back fondly from the experiences I gained, but it was a tough year for me, and it really propelled me to get back home.
Tell me about your time at the Fan, how that came about, what that time was like.
Oh man, that is always going to be one of the very best times of my radio career. I actually had applied to the Fan on 3 prior occasions. I don't keep much. I'm notoriously bad for keeping records, keeping photos, but I have got a file folder full of rejection letters. And again, this goes back to when you would send out physical tapes, right? I would send out cassettes. And Nelson Millman, who was the program director for as long as I could remember, I have 3 separate rejection letters from him. So the time I actually made it, when I finally did, it wasn't an actual application. It was then I'd been in the business long enough, and the program director at the Fan I had worked for in the past, and he's like, I've got an opening, and that's how it went down. And it was tremendous, terrifying. And I did that when I was 15 years or so in the business. Like I had a little bit of background, and maybe I could have argued I belonged there. But when I first sat down, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm in Toronto. I'm on the biggest sports radio station in Canada. How am I going to handle this? And I got all the time in the world for Greg Brady, who was the main host at the time and still remains today, who was so good to me. And taught me so much without even trying, and it was honestly I could go on and on about how great the experience was, and it felt good. I mean, I'll tell you the quick aside. This is kind of what made it. Jerry Howarth comes into the station the one day, and again, this is a guy, Tom and Jerry, you grew up listening to. Jerry is still the very best out there as far as baseball play-by-play goes, and he's in the station one morning. And so we're just having a little casual chat. He says, "Oh, you're the new guy that does the updates in the morning, right?" I said, "Yeah, yes, I am." He says, "You do a fine job." Jerry Howarth said, "I do a fine job," like in the classic kind of sense, right? And I was over the moon. It was a great experience.
Were you driving back and forth at that time? Had you moved to Toronto? What was the arrangement?
I didn't go to Toronto. I stayed in Kitchener. I had done a brief stint in Toronto earlier in my career and lived and worked there. This time I drove back and forth. So I was doing the morning show, 5:30 till 9, and my alarm would go off at 2:30 a.m. here in Kitchener. And I'd get up and be on the road between 3 and 3:15, get to the station for about 4:30, grab a coffee, and start plugging away for the 5:30 show.
Commitment, jeez.
Yeah, it was. And I mean, if I had been sitting in traffic, it wouldn't have been something I would have done for too long. But the benefit was, of course, at that hour of the day, and even coming home, it really was never much longer than an hour and 15 minutes. But when I got back home and I started working in town again and my commute was 7 minutes, what a difference in your life that makes.
I'm going to pump your tires a bit, so keep your ego in check for this part.
Okay.
But so when I was going across the country, when I was traveling and thinking about where I wanted to end up when I came back, what made me ultimately think of coming back to the area, the place I grew up in, was to see people like you that had a commitment to the area, to see the investment in the community and the idea of developing the place that you grew up in. I would compare it to LeBron James. Here's where the pumping your tires comes into play. LeBron, going to Miami and deciding, this would feel that much sweeter to do it back home in Cleveland. What was it for you that made you want to come back to the area and stay?
Well, can I inflate your tires in exchange first? Because what you did, Martin, still blows my mind. I mean, it was an incredibly disciplined and devoted thing that you did, and I'm so impressed by you for doing it. I think it's fantastic. And I'm not sure there was ever really any doubt. I think it's one of the reasons that I stayed here and commuted when I was going back, like when I had the job at the Fan, because this is home. And it's very kind of you to describe me in the way that you do, but truly I have met more people that I can count on one hand that have done the same thing that you describe me as doing or having done, and that's building this community. That's taking there are role models that I could rattle off to you that, for me, I mean, like teachers from high school, our current mayor, I could go on and on about people that have also kind of done the same thing and inspired me to want to do that. But more than anything, it's home, and I am so grateful to this community. I feel so many times like it's just gotten up and given me this great big hug. It's taken care of me all through my life, and I can't help but want to give back to it.
Well, tell me maybe about one or two of those influences, people that you see in the community and have seen in your years and made you want to be a part of what they're doing.
I go back to a teacher in high school by the name of Dan Hutter, who inspired me in so many ways because of his dedication to students beyond the classroom. That was one of the first real indicators I had of somebody that it's not just a job, right? I mean, you can go and you can work till the final bell at 3:10 or whatever time it was and go home for the day. And this guy never did. Not only did he make himself available to students after class, but I was part of drama, surprisingly, in high school, and he was one of those guys that was part of the school productions as well, on his own time, right? Those things really had an impact on me, with a guy like that giving outside of the job. And I look at people in this business. There's a fellow by the name of Neil Headley. He is less remembered for what's called the Poster Boy campaign here in town than Brian Burke, who was the guy that took it over from Neil Headley and was the one that was with the program or the campaign till it ended. Neil Headley got this thing started by literally living on a billboard until X number of dollars was raised. And I thought, that's a pretty selfless thing to do. Then you've got a guy like our current police chief, who, when I first met him, was just, quote unquote, just a media guy with Waterloo Regional Police, but who just he's just a constant presence. Brian Larkin is in our community, and it's easy to kind of get excited by that. Rosemary Smith is another wonderful example with the KW Community Foundation, who, I guess by her role, had to be involved, but you knew with Rosemary, she wasn't just places because she had to be there. It's because she wanted to be. She walked the talk, so to speak. And then, oh my goodness, Governor General David Johnston was the president of the University of Waterloo while I was there. An inspiring guy, a guy that you would see around campus doing things. If there's a piece of garbage on the ground, he's going to pick it up. And then years later, I get the chance to interview him. And some days after that, a handwritten note comes from the president of the University of Waterloo saying, "Thanks for the interview. You did a great job. By the way, 96, the year I graduated, was a great year. David Johnston." I mean, who does that sort of thing, right? Those were the kinds of examples that I had to Dom Cardillo. Honestly, Martin, I'll talk all day. There have been myriad people in this community that have, without even saying, follow my lead, they've blazed the trail, and it's easy to follow.
I want to go back into the radio booth again. So you've already talked about growing up, having a love for radio, being a sports fan, an avid sports fan. Some ways down the road, you eventually end up in a booth standing next to Don Cameron. And if somebody doesn't know who Don Cameron is, Don Cameron, a name that is pretty much synonymous, first of all, with the franchise Kitchener Rangers and also the game of hockey. One of the longest standing play-by-play guys you could see in the game, and somebody who's so highly regarded. You get to be the guy next to him. What was that experience like?
Pinch me now. Honestly, I spoke with Don not more than 5 days ago, and we just speak as friends now, right? I mean, well, we always did, but I still cannot. I really can't even comprehend it. So, again, it much like I talked about earlier with all of the radio personalities from my youth. Don Cameron was the soundtrack to my hockey youth. I remember vividly a summer, it would have been the late 80s, the Rangers were in a playoff series against the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds, and I remember it so well because it was warm weather and I was going to work on a car with my buddy, so I was in high school because that's the stuff I did, and I remember driving to his place listening to Don Cameron call the game from Sault Ste. Marie on my radio. The first game I ever did alongside Don Cameron, it was a fill-in gig, which I think was good because when I kind of moved in full-time to work with him, I had a little bit of exposure. I was weak in the knees. I remember it vividly. It was in Windsor against the Spitfires at the WFCU Center, and during the national anthem, I had butterflies. I felt weak in the knees, all of it, the chills, the shivers, whatever you want to say. It was just, I couldn't believe it. And then to have him treat me as an equal, and again, just show me without trying to how a pro acts and how a pro does it. And sometimes I'd honestly get caught up just listening to him call the game and realize, oh wait, I have to fill in some time here and do my job, right? Couple of quick stories about that. So way back in the very beginning, as I said, I was out in Salmon Arm, British Columbia, and I started out, that's my first full-time job. I'm either going to be the next John Derringer or I'm going to be the next Bob Cole. And after I realized it was time for me to move on from small-town BC, I wrote Don Cameron a letter. And I basically asked for the how-to manual to get his job someday, or a job like it. And Don Cameron, who didn't know me from Adam, wrote me back and spelled it out for me. I mean, who does that? Don Cameron, that's who. And I mentioned the Jerry Howarth story before, which stands out just because he's such a the classic phrasing, you do a fine job. Not as a, your wife would say fine to you. That's a bad thing when a woman says it, right? No, for Jerry Howarth meant, in that classic sense. So fast forward to the end of Don's time, and he's the guest of honor at a Kitchener Sports Association banquet, and I got invited quietly because they didn't want Don to know they were going to give him this big award, and I know Don, and he wouldn't like. So I absolutely wanted to show up and listen to Don speak, and so clearly it was a part of his speech that he had to go off the cuff because he didn't know I'd be there, and he singled me out. And it wasn't so much the fact that he said something nice about me, it's how he said it. He says, Mike was an A1 partner. Again, this classic phrasing from this classic broadcaster. And I still joke. I'm pretty sure my Twitter profile says I have Don Cameron on speed dial because when my phone lights up with his name, it still makes me feel like a kid because it's Don Cameron, right? It was fantastic.
He's one of those guys that always seems to have the right words for the moment. Being in a booth with him, what are the moments that you think back to, whether it's a phrasing, a way that he described a play, or just something that you remember years later?
High, wide, and not so handsome is one that always stands out. If you ever have a moment, I believe it was our second season working together. I started a hashtag Don Cameronisms, and sometimes I'll still go back and read some because I can't remember them all. But he's great. He tried to paint the masterpiece when all he needed was some whitewash for the barn. He prayed that one to the net when a player was on his knees. I mean, there were lots of, he couldn't buy a goal with a fistful of tens, like little things like that. So he had a great way. He could turn all kinds of phrases, and you're right, never lost for words. I remember a playoff game in Kitchener, and the Rangers scored a big goal, and it was the first time I had seen Don. I mean, he knows how to capture the moment and the essence and the importance of the game. And this was as elevated as I had seen him get. And we never got to call the championship together, sadly, because I would have liked to go through that with him. Anyway, when he called this goal, he kind of reared back and his knees bent and the head was back, and it was kind of this bellow as Don Cameron would with the scars. And it was I can still visually see him rearing back like that. It was a fantastic memory.
You every May is a big time for your life. You dedicate yourself to Cystic Fibrosis Canada. It's a cause that you've already mentioned has been very close to your heart and continues to be. Can you take me back to the significance of that in your life, how it's impacted your family, what it meant for you seeing your sisters go through it?
Yeah, this was a tough one for me, and it's still something I describe as a labor of love. So growing up with cystic fibrosis in the family, my older sister, one of my older sisters, and then my youngest sister, who I was very close to. So they have cystic fibrosis, and it really didn't register a whole lot. I mean, it's a terminal disease. There's still no cure. We knew, obviously. It's easier to say now that I'm an old man, 45 years old, and you can see it a lot differently. But anyway, you just never thought about the end game then, obviously. So it was just a daily regimen for my sisters, and it became part of our life. So they'd take all of these enzymes or pills with each meal, and there would be noise twice a day when they did their treatments. There was a percussion to help beat mucus out of their lungs, and basically what would look like an oxygen mask that went around their heads, and they would breathe in some medicine through that. Again, it's all designed to keep the lungs clear. And the enzymes would help with digestion. Those are the two main areas that CF affects, right? The lungs and the digestive system. And again, never really thought about the ultimate end of it all, even though you knew what that would be if you stopped to think about it. So when I was a kid, we even held some little fundraising street parties in the neighborhood to raise some money for cystic fibrosis, as kids would do. You might make $50 or $60, and you think you've conquered the world, and off you go and make your donation and whatnot. It was within 9 months I lost both of my sisters. My older sister, Luann, she'd be what you'd call a textbook case. Went through all of just everything, and you knew. And she was 24 years old, and at the time that was average life expectancy. She was ready. She expected. We all expected it. Still, devastatingly sad, but expected. And then 9 months later, losing my little sister Sherry at the age of 18 was excruciating. It truly, truly was. So I kind of went into a hole for a little while, and I think our whole family did, really, and didn't give it much thought. And then after a while, as I got more and more involved in my career and thought, well, my sisters aren't here, and they did some pretty great things. Like my older sister, Luann Martin, she was a babysitter. That's what she did. There were 24 kids in the neighborhood that will still to this day credit her for the care that she gave them as children. I remember running into one of them one day at a bank machine. I'm pulling out some money, and there's this big brute behind me, and he's kind of looking at me funny, and then you're Mike, right? And then he explains, Luann babysat me and blah, blah, blah. That's the impact she had. Anyway, so the more I started thinking about it, and I realized clearly they made the impact they could while they were here. What the hell am I doing with myself? And it goes back to that Roberto Clemente. Am I wasting my life because I've got something to give because I'm still here? So I simply just went back and became a volunteer with the local cystic fibrosis chapter. And then there was a split. Zellers, and this is not to speak ill of Hudson's Bay Company and Zellers when it was around, but they used to be the big title sponsor of what was called then the Zellers Moonwalk for cystic fibrosis. And that partnership ended, so we were kind of on our own as a district. So we had to figure out our own big fundraising walk, and I was tasked with kind of emceeing it because that's the sort of shtick I had, and so I did, and that got me a little more heavily involved. And of course, if you're going out to the walk every year, you're going to go around like everybody else with your pledge sheet and say, "Will you sponsor me?" And that's just how it went. So I would MC, I would go around and collect pledges, and I'm lousy at asking for things. Like I'm really I'm terrible. And so it was hard for me just every year, same thing over and over again. You want to make a donation, you want to make a donation. So I started trying to think of different ways to raise money. And after a while, I started doing stunts, right? So I stepped into the ring with Fitz the Whip Vanderpool, and let me tell you, even when he's sparring with you, he hits you. I sat in a dunk tank at Waterloo Square. I jumped out of an airplane. And after a few years, I kind of felt like I'd exhausted these things. And I just had this idea in the back of my head. And I didn't really give it much more thought than that. I just was asking myself, what can I do so I don't have to ask anymore? And then this idea called Farwell for Hire was born. And I remember it vividly. I was at the Citizen of the Year dinner. It was April the 30th, and I'd kind of had this idea stewing in the back of my head. And so I sent out a tweet. I should go back and find that tweet. I really should, because it was the tweet that launched what is now about to become a 4-year campaign. And I used the hashtag Farwell, the number 4, hire. And it was simply a concept of hire me to do a job. I'll cut your lawn, I'll rake your leaves, I'll do whatever you need me to do, and you pay me by donation to Cystic Fibrosis. And the very first year, up until then, when I started getting into the stunts, the most I had ever made was about $8,000, which is pretty darn good.
Yeah.
But I thought, let's take this to the next level. So I set a goal of $10,000 with this campaign, and the very first year we blow through 20 grand. I'm like, how did that happen? I have no idea. But it was something that just captured people's attention. So the next year I thought, okay, well, we caught lightning in a bottle. We'll set a goal of 20 grand again and see what happens. And next thing you know, it's 28 grand. So I thought, well, good for us. It's great. So we're going to do it again. And in the third year, I set a goal of $30,000, and we made $47,000. I mean, it's silly is what it is. But it just is something that has caught on beyond my wildest expectations. And I put no more thought into it other than a hashtag. And it was truly born out of my distaste for asking for things. I don't like to do it. I'll give you the shirt off my back if somebody asks me for something, but I'm not good at doing the asking. And it's funny because if I tie it back into my career, everybody said in the very beginning, "Oh, you'll end up in sales someday. That's where the money is." Well, it is, because I see the sales guy driving a Porsche and I drive a Jetta. Okay, but it's just not my cup of tea. I just don't do it well. So that's kind of how the fundraising campaign was born, and here it is today. And now I'm honestly trying to figure out how we diplomatically end this someday, because I'm not getting any younger, and I worry, honestly, that people, they're so good to me. They're so gosh darn good to me. And, oh, we love it and keep doing it. But I feel like in the month of May, like I'm all over people's social media feeds, and they must be getting sick of me. So when June comes around, I just kind of go under the covers for a little while and hide. But there seems to be an appetite still. Anyway, I'm getting carried away. That's how the campaign started, and it's been wonderful, and I've met so many people through it that knew my sisters and support because of that. And listen, I'm not going to lie, I've shed my share of tears over it, but I will go to Mount Hope Cemetery and I'll visit the gravesite, and that's what I think about. I mean, they got robbed of the last 20 years that I've had to try to do something, right? And so that's why I do it.
How old were you when you lost your sisters?
I would have been 22.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm a 1971. So it was September of '93, just after my 22nd birthday, that we lost Luann, and then June of '94. So just before my 23rd birthday. And let me tell you, I mean, I don't know. You feel like an adult then, obviously. I already had a kid by that point, and but you're not really. And it had a much greater impact on me than I knew at the time. It did. It changes everything, right? And yeah, it was, like I said, I kind of disappeared for a little while and I didn't want anything to do with cystic fibrosis. And the funny thing is, now being back, many of those same families are still involved, and man, do I respect them for still staying with it, right? Because many have had their own losses, and they're still there doing their thing, right? Which is damned impressive.
What do you remember most about your two sisters? What was the mark they left on you?
Luann was her. Okay, I don't know even what would I start and how would I describe it. She was a giver for sure. I remember at Christmas. Like I said, she was a babysitter. Like she was a babysitter back in the $2 an hour days. Okay, but she would go dawn till midnight. I mean, 17, 18 hours a day, just babysitting kids, and money. So I borrowed money from her a lot to build a car back in the day. Like I built a classic Mustang with money funded by my sister. And I remember paying her back one Christmas in cash in this shoebox. And when she opened this box and she starts going through this money, she had this biggest grin on her face, right? But she devoted her life. She absolutely devoted her life to the children she would never have herself, right? And she quit school to do it, which is tough when your father's a teacher, right? Anyway, the giving nature. And my sister Sherry, her laugh, she was so high energy. And this kid, she'd go out and she'd play on the school basketball team when she had no right business being out there because of the lung capacity, right? And she didn't care. Like, she would just give her, you know? And then you see her on the bench sometimes, and she'd have to take a bit of a break, and you could hear the cough, which is a very distinct cough if you know people with CF. But her energy and her spirit, and that's what I'll always remember about her for sure, the energy and the spirit.
To go back to Farwell for Hire again, you start getting the response from the community, people latching onto this. What are some of the things that people are asking you to do? Some of the ones that you remember, maybe, I mean, everybody knows maybe raking a lawn or mowing a lawn. What are some of the more unconventional ones that have happened in the years since?
Selfishly, this is one of the things that makes it great, because I joke a lot, but it's true. Like, what I do for a living, it's a stretch to call it work. I never break a sweat, right? I'm in climate-controlled conditions all the time. I could speak a lot about that. But I actually enjoy the aspect of accomplishing something, whether it's mowing a lawn or weeding a garden. But I have also been afforded the opportunity to do all kinds of things, right? Like, businesses will let me in and help brew a beer. I helped Rob Brady at Brady's Meats make schnitzel one time, and I was pounding veal, things like that. But then I also got involved in all kinds of goofy things with a horse owner. I cleaned the sheath of a horse one time. I encourage you just to Google that, please, and then, like I did before I did it, and I responded saying, that looks to me like something you'd need to have a veterinarian's degree for. And they're like, no, horse owners do it for their own horses all the time. Okay. I gelded a calf. A buddy of mine who fixes motorcycles said, come on up to the shop and spend an afternoon. We'll work on bikes. I'll put you to work in the shop. I'm like, great. But he had an ulterior motive, and he's got some farmland, and next thing you know, that was an experience I'm not too fond of repeating, although I would do it for the campaign. I did a brake job on a race truck last year under close supervision, but that's, again, going back to my days as a bit of a gearhead. I enjoyed getting in there and getting dirty. But if I can tell you, one of my favorite so far experiences, and I've actually been thinking about it as the campaign approaches it in this year, came last year when I got an email out of the blue from somebody I don't even know. And they have a daughter in high school at Cameron Heights, and I guess the parents, as a group, take turns carpooling the kids home. And so it was this couple's turn, and they were unable to do it. So rather than throw off the schedule of the other parents involved, they asked me, would you please go to Cameron Heights Collegiate and pick up our daughter and bring her home from school? Yes. Then the job got extended to say, you can take one of our vehicles. You have your choice between an Acura SUV, our whatever pickup truck, and a Ford Mustang GT convertible. And I'm, okay, I'm going to take the Mustang, thank you. All of this is happening over email. So finally, at one point, it was a Saturday night, and we connected on the phone. And Mike and Tanya Ciceretto are their names. And I had Mike on the phone, and I said, listen, I mean, then the job was going to be that Monday. I'm like, I'm there. I'm all in for this. I said, but you're putting an awful lot of faith in somebody you have never met. And he just laughed and said, I know where to find you, Farwell, and that was that, right? And I understand. I mean, it was a calculated risk, if you want to call it that, on the part of the family, because yes, I kind of have a bit of a public persona. But think about that. So they trust me with their high-performance sports car to pick up their teenage daughter. And oh yeah, by the way, they gave me the electronic key code to their garage to go and pick up the car. So that Monday, I go and I punch in the key code, just like they say, and there's this garage opening up, and there are the vehicles, and I go to the Mustang, and the keys with my donation are sitting on the front seat, like they said. I could have made off like a bandit right then. I hop in this car, and I drive it down to Cameron Heights, and I pick up the kids, and the faith that they showed in a fellow human being, that's one of my favorite stories to come out of 3 years of the campaign so far. I love it. And they're going to be repeat customers. They're already planning to hire me again this year, and stuff like that I just find absolutely amazing.
It kind of reminds me, going back to you're talking about your reasons of wanting to stick around in the area, this idea of a community raising you up countless times. To think about moments like that and people getting involved in a cause that's so important to you, what is that like to see the response that you've had?
This community is still raising me up. It truly, truly is. I said earlier, it's like that big hug. It feels like that. It really does. And I don't know how, and I don't know why, and I don't know how I got so lucky. I don't. But believe me, I cannot state emphatically enough that it's not lost on me. Like, this just doesn't happen to people. This is, I don't know what it was. Is it, if you believe in stuff like that, is it the spirit of my sisters with their, I don't know, Martin, I don't know. but I'm so glad it's worked out the way that it has. I mean, I am the luckiest man on earth. I'm the luckiest man on earth.
You mentioned already, you've been in the boxing ring with Fitz Vanderpool. You didn't mention this, but you've also interviewed Geddy Lee.
Oh my gosh!
All kinds of memories you could draw from in your career. What are the highlights for you? What's the one or two things that stick out to you?
You know what the best part of the best worst part? The internet's a funny place, eh? If it wasn't for social media, the Farwell for Hire campaign would probably never have gotten off the ground. In the first year, it was all social media, and I have had the tremendous benefit of the weight of Rogers Radio behind me in the years since. Anyway, I think about this particularly social media because the interview with Geddy Lee I have a picture of that I'm so damn proud of. And I posted it one time years later as a profile picture or something on Facebook, and all people did was make fun of the jacket I was wearing. I'm like, hang on a second, I am interviewing Geddy Lee right now. Like, come on. Anyway, that absolutely, as a lifelong Rush fan, to get to do that, I fanboyed a little bit. I really did. As a lifelong Leafs fan, I came of age with the Toronto Maple Leafs in 1993 with that magical year to the conference finals against the Los Angeles Kings, and I have still a Doug Gilmour jersey. Well, fast forward to my time at the Fan 590 in Toronto, and Doug Gilmour is not only the general manager of the Kingston Frontenacs in the OHL, but he's a frequent guest on the radio station. And so he'd be in the radio station, and I'd be part of interviews with Doug Gilmour. I didn't fanboy like I did with Mike Cooper, as I told you that story earlier, but I certainly enjoyed the moment. And I did fanboy, although I tried not to let Doug know. The one day I was on my way out of the station and he was on his way in, and we passed each other in the hall, and he said, "Hi, Mike." And I almost lost my marbles because Doug Gilmour had just greeted me by name. So that was a bit of a highlight. And you know what? Just recently, this talk of fanboydom kind of stands out to me. Chris Mayberry, who's not the biggest name in broadcasting, he probably was retired before you got. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He was a longtime voice on what used to be called broadcast news, is now called Canadian Press, but they fill in newscasts and when radio stations aren't live. And all my broadcasting life, from that time doing overnights in Brantford, I would run, at the time we called them BN, broadcast newscasts in the overnights. And Chris Mayberry was a frequent contributor. He was a sports guy, so he'd file reports from wherever. Just in the past week, Chris Mayberry started following me on Twitter. And I'm like, Chris Mayberry. I sent him a note, and I said, you know what? I'm too old to care about stuff like this anymore, so I'm just going to tell you, huge fan. And I fanboyed a little bit when you started following me on Twitter. There are lots. And again, I feel almost embarrassed to say, because like, who's luckier, right? Like, I don't have to work for a living, and I get backstage access to all sorts of things. I'm very spoiled that way.
You've had a pretty wonderful career and been able to get involved in a lot of different things. What is something, though, that you'd like to still do that you haven't done yet?
Oh, man. You know, I have to be really careful with this because I'm not ready for it to be done, right? And every time I get the chance to go back to a college and talk to broadcasting students, I tell them, you know, you can like my job, but you can't have it yet because I'm not done with it. I am in the midst of doing a morning show on an FM station in my hometown. I am doing play-by-play for the Kitchener Rangers, which you can call me biased if you want to, but is probably the Toronto Maple Leafs of the Canadian Hockey League, certainly of the Ontario Hockey League. I mean, it's a pretty big deal. And I did have a chance a few years ago to take that next step, if you want to call it that, to a professional level of hockey. And I turned it down because of my connections to this community and what I just described to you. I mean, is it a morning show in Toronto? No. Did it have to be? No. Would Hockey Night in Canada be nice? Maybe, but is it pretty awesome doing the Toronto Maple Leafs of the Ontario Hockey League? Sure as heck is, and I don't have to travel as far to do it. So I feel like in many ways I'm kind of living the dream, but selfishly I will say this: I would like to I would like to I would like to have a fundraising campaign that makes $100,000. How it does that, I'm not sure yet. But I would like to be a part. I would like to contribute to something like that in this community, and I think that's it. I would like to leverage the power of what we're able to do in broadcasting and turn it into something like that.
Last thing, Mike, how can somebody get involved if they want to be a part of this Farwell for Hire? They want to hire you for a job. Is it too late? If it's not too late, how do they get a hold of you?
It's never too late, okay? Last year, I kind of joked, and I took it till what I think I called May 37th. It was into June, and I pushed it a little bit. But here's the cool thing again. I had a friend, so she now works in alumni relations with Conestoga College, of which I'm an alum. And she had reached out near the beginning of the campaign and said, I'd like to put this in our newsletter and spread the word a little bit more. And I'm like, this is great. Any exposure I can get is fantastic. And so when we met, she's like, I need to be able to point somebody to a website. Do you have anything? I'm like, nope, I don't, because I'm not very good at that. And when the campaign comes around, it's just a matter of work, and get it done. So she's like, well, just make a Facebook page, almost like a business page, right? Get likes on it, things like that. Like, okay. And I honestly didn't even know where to begin. Like, I have my own personal Facebook page, and that's how this has always been run. So she takes me through the steps of just making a page, like a business page. And then 3 days later, she emails me and says, my husband and I have this idea. We'd like to put by you. You want to meet? Yep. Anyway, her husband's a graphic designer, and they have created, honestly, they've created a campaign within the campaign, and there's now branding for Farwell for Hire, and there's this whole Facebook page and a Gmail account. So it's Farwell, 4 Hire @gmail.com. You can find on Facebook, facebook.com/Farwell, 4 Hire. I mean, it looks like I'm a legitimate thing, and I had nothing to do with it. I didn't do anything. These and the graphics look so super cool. Honestly, it's like we planned it, and I had nothing to do with it whatsoever. But the easy way is, Farwell, 4 Hire @gmail.com. You can follow the hashtag, and I'm not hard to find. Reach out anytime, any way, and we'll get the job done.
Thanks so much, Mike. This has been great.
It's been great for me. I'm sorry for wasting all your tape.
That's it for the show. Thanks for listening, and I hope you liked it. Mike is a born storyteller, and what an inspiration. A guy who gives a damn. You can find out more about him. Just search Farwell for Hire on Facebook or Twitter. If you like the show, good news. It's on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher. Help me out and head on over to one of those and hit subscribe. And while you're at it, leave a rating too. You can really help in getting this podcast out there to other people, or just share it with your friends. That's cool too. Theme music for the show is by Dr. Turtle off the album You I'll Ah. I'm Martin Bauman, and this was A Story Untold. See you next time.